Chapter 29, William Slack Jr. Lieutenant Bill Slack Jr. didn't want to be placed in charge of the Cuban units. He liked working as operations lieutenant, and everyone knew that overseeing the Cubans was a thankless and nerve-wracking job. Word had also spread through the prison that Warden Matthews had called for an investigation of suspected brutality in the Cuban cell house, which made the job even less appealing, particularly to Slack. The last thing he needed was to be linked to a messy brutality case. Slack couldn't prove it, but he was certain that he had been blacklisted by the Bureau for the last 5 years. Slack had advanced quickly when he joined the Bureau as a guard in 1971, but the promotions had stopped in 1983, and Slack knew why. It was his father. William D. Slack Sr. had been a lieutenant at the federal prison in Petersburg, Virginia, just south of Washington, D.C., when black gangs from New York City and Washington clashed in the prison dining room on Christmas Day in 1982. Gregory J. Gunter, a 31-year-old guard, had been trapped between the warring gangs and was stabbed to death. 2 days later, the senior Slack was responsible for getting gang members out of their cells and ready to be moved to other prisons. 2 guards under his command began manhandling inmates in retaliation for the murder of Gunter. One sprayed tear gas on a shirt and stuffed it into a belligerent inmate's mouth. Another kicked a naked inmate in the chest. Over the years, there had always been an understanding that if an inmate attacked a guard, that inmate would later receive an ass whooping. But Bureau Director Norman Carlson didn't believe in vigilante justice. If staff used appropriate force, I backed them to the hilt, he said later. But if they used it inappropriately and simply thumped inmates, I did the best I could to get them fired and prosecuted. I felt the message had to get out loud and clear that this was not the way we were going to operate. When Carlson had heard about the brutality at Petersburg, he asked the FBI to investigate and encouraged the Department of Justice to prosecute. 2 guards and Slack as their supervisor were indicted. The senior Slack had worked at the hot house before moving to Petersburg, and his friends were outraged when they heard that he was going to be tried for permitting what many guards considered had been the proper thing to do. My God, a veteran Leavenworth guard recalled, this wasn't some case of a guard beating up an inmate on a whim. These bastards had killed a guard, and in the old days, they would have been thankful just to get off with having their asses whooped. The fact that Carlson investigated the Petersburg incident so infuriated some old-time guards that 1 year later, when Silverstein and Fountain murdered officers Klutz and Hoffman and Marion, they unfairly blamed Carlson for the deaths. Thanks to Carlson, every inmate knew there wasn't a damn thing we could do if they attacked us, said one disgruntled veteran. He made it so that the inmates had more rights than we did. A U.S. District Court judge found the senior Slack guilty of violating the inmates' civil rights by taking part in a conspiracy to punish inmates for the murder of Officer Gunter. The judge said Slack also attempted to keep the brutality from being exposed. Slack was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but all but 4 months were suspended. Bill Slack Jr. had been devastated by his father's conviction and prison sentence. My dad always did everything the Bureau asked of him, he recalled. The Bureau was his life, and then suddenly, because of that one incident, all those years of service and dedication didn't seem to matter. It didn't seem fair. When Slack was first indicted, the staff at the hot house rallied around his family and raised money for his defense. But after he was found guilty, the support waned. Bill Slack wanted to resign, but his father talked him out of it. My dad told me, "This has ruined my life. If it ruins yours, that will hurt me even more," so I stayed on. On the day his father was taken to prison, a fellow guard brought Slack a teletype that showed which camp his father had been sent to. I was furious, Bill Slack recalled. I couldn't believe that my father was an inmate. Slack began looking at convicts at the hot house differently. I'd seen how an officer treats an inmate, and I'd asked myself, if that were my father, would I want him treated that way? I began to realize that sometimes there were better ways to solve a problem than by simply sending an inmate to the hole. Slack soon found himself being passed over for promotions and being viewed by some co-workers with suspicion. At one point, he called a friend in the Bureau's headquarters and asked him why the promotions had stopped. The Slack name, he was told, was synonymous with the Petersburg incident. Over the years, other guards had been fired for brutality. and a handful had even been prosecuted, but his father was the first lieutenant ever sent to prison for not stopping brutality done in retaliation for the murder of a guard. His father's case had become an unofficial watershed within the Bureau. From that point on, guards knew that brutality was illegal regardless of the provocation. Carlson had made his point, but in the process, the Slack name had been permanently linked with misconduct. No one wanted to risk promoting the Slack, Bill Slack recalled. I was a reminder, an embarrassment. Once again, Slack thought about quitting, but decided against it. Later, he would jokingly recall that one of his relatives had once boxed an exhibition match in Boxton Garden against the heavyweight champion John L. Sullivan to raise money for charity. He wasn't a good enough boxer to tie Sullivan's shoes, Slack recalled, but he considered it an honor to step into that ring, and he never did let Sullivan knock him down. He just took the licking and kept coming back for more. The comparison Slack decided fit. Born and raised in Worcester, Massachusetts, Slack had grown up tough. When he was 7, he joined a local gang of white Catholic boys. In our neighborhood, you either joined a gang or everyone wanted to fight you, we recall. He was frequently in fights, and whenever he came home with a black eye, his father marched him into the basement, and they put on the gloves. He'd really lay it on me. I know what you did wrong, he'd say, and then pow, he hit me with his left, Slack recalled. He'd really whip me good, but I don't believe he did it out of anger. He had grown up in the same type of neighborhood, and he didn't want me to go out there and be a badass. But he knew that if a boy in our neighborhood didn't defend himself, everyone would pick on him and beat him up, and he didn't want that for his son. Slack joined the Marine Corps after high school and was sent to Vietnam as a radio man. When he was discharged in October 1970, he returned to Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, where his father had gone to work as a prison guard. The younger Slack joined the Bureau too and discovered that the fact that his father was a guard didn't mean that he was treated any better than the other new hires. In those days, no one trusted you until you proved that you weren't a coward or a snitch, said Slack. The older officers used to send you down to ask the captain for a piece of equipment that didn't exist. After the captain chewed your ass for being so stupid, he'd ask, "Hey, who put you up to this?" And if you told, everyone knew you were a rat and couldn't be trusted. Like most other penitentiaries, Lewisburg had its own version of what is known in the Bureau as the acid test. Whenever an inmate refused to come out of his cell, the old-timers would make certain that a new guard went through the door first. The older guards would wait a few minutes before coming to the rescue. They wanted to see how the new guard reacted to violence. There was a sense of brotherhood among the staff, and they didn't just let anyone into their group because they knew that someday their life might depend on you, and they didn't want just anyone behind them who was going to run away or who was going to rat on them, said Slack. Slack was finally accepted after he grabbed an inmate who was swinging a knife at another convict. Another guard tackled the convict's unarmed opponent. But when the operations lieutenant wrote up his report, the guard's roles were reversed. The report said this other guy had grabbed the inmate with the knife, not me. He had 7 years experience, and the lieutenant wanted him to get the promotion. Slack didn't complain. When new officers come into the prison, they are given a rule book, but they are really educated by their peers, said Slack. And the same is true for inmates. Most hook up with someone and find out the unwritten rules. Where to eat in the dining room, who's a snitch, who they can trust. They're both caught in the same world where there are rules and then there are rules. What Slack tried to do, especially after his father's conviction, was not to worry about which set of rules to adhere to, but to treat inmates with compassion and common sense. I am almost ashamed to say it in public, but the key to being a good correctional officer is having a caring attitude. Now, that sounds to most staff here as being weak and not very macho, Slack said. It sounds like you are giving in to the inmates, or at least that is how the staff interprets it anyway, but it is not the same at all. Our job is to be professional and to get the job done, and the best way to do that is by letting your conscience be your guide, not by always following this regulation or that procedure. If an inmate hasn't had a change of underwear in 2 weeks, you should care enough to get him a change of underwear. If he hasn't had a shower in a week, you should care enough to get him a shower. You shouldn't have to wait for someone to tell you to do that, or have some regulation tell you. Slack's attitude was not always appreciated by others, particularly those who were sticklers for regulations. Once, while escorting an inmate to a federal courthouse for a trial outside Leavenworth, Slack drove through the drive-in lane of a fast food restaurant and told the prisoner to order whatever he wanted. I told him that I'd treat him to Burger King if he didn't give us any shit, Slack explained to the guard with him. But the guard later complained because bureau regulations only allowed inmates to have something to eat if they were being transported during regular meal times and were traveling a specific number of miles outside the prison. When Slack was asked by his superiors why he bought the inmate lunch, Slack replied, because the inmate was hungry. To you and me, eating at Burger King isn't a big deal, Slack said, recalling the incident. But to a guy who's been locked up for 10 or 15 years, it's a real treat. It makes them feel like they're still part of the outside world. Slack also wanted to make a point. Some U.S. Marshals and other lieutenants pull a cheap trick on inmates during their outside trips by telling an inmate that he'll get fed when he gets to prison. Only when the inmate finally gets there, he finds that the kitchen is closed and he's out of meal. Meanwhile, the marshal pockets the money that he should have spent feeding the inmate. It's not right, and I want inmates to know I don't play that game. Slack's supervisors decided to forget about the Burger King incident. Neither Warden Matthews nor Associate Warden Connor gave Slack a choice about overseeing the Cuban units. Lieutenant Monty Watkins would be his second in command. They told Slack that he would take charge of the Cubans on September 20th. Slack knew that the guards' morale in the Cuban cell blocks was miserable and that the detainees were more raucous than ever. He didn't know how much time he would have to familiarize himself with the Cubans and to figure out how to improve things. As it turned out, he didn't get any time. Late in the afternoon that Slack took charge, the Cubans in C Cell House rioted.